If you've been around here for a couple weeks, we've been going through this series called Divine Interruption. We've all heard of divine intervention, but we've been talking about divine interruptions. I'll get you caught up to speed for anyone who maybe hasn't been here the past couple weeks. But we've heard of divine intervention before, and we like that, right? The idea when things are just looking uncertain, and God steps in a way and does something that it is just clear that it was God's work and that there's no other explanation. But we've been talking about divine interruptions, and interruptions are things that we don't usually respond as well to. But we looked at the life of Jesus over the past couple weeks, and we're going to be closing out this series today. But we've been looking at how Jesus lived the most important life ever, had the most important mission the world has ever seen, but was constantly interrupted. And how he didn't brush those interruptions off, but he often welcomed those interruptions. And some of the moments where he's interrupted became some of the moments that we're still here talking about 2,000 years later. And so Jesus welcomed the interruptions. And another thing we've been talking about is for us as followers of Jesus, we aren't just called to cling to his words, but to follow the example that he set for us. That Jesus didn't just step in, talk to one guy and say, hey, I got something for you to write this down, and then I got to go to a cross. No, he lived a life, and he modeled a life for us to follow. And the Bible says that as his followers, if we claim to follow him, we need to live in the way that he did. And so we've been looking to the words of Jesus and to the life of Jesus so that we can become better imitators of Jesus. So that first week we talked about the great interruption, that Jesus was constantly interrupted, but he is also the great interrupter, that he stepped into all of our lives, and he gave us an invitation, follow me, to come follow after me. And we all receive that invitation, and when we do, it is an interruption in our lives in a radical way that changes our lives going forward. It changes the total trajectory of our lives and the purpose that we live for, and calls us to a whole new life. And going forward, we live in a whole new way. And then we looked at the life of Jesus, and we looked at some of those moments where he was interrupted, when he was interrupted by the little children coming to him. We talked about how once we follow Jesus, it starts with a call to follow him, and then we are called to action. We are called to a purpose. And then after that, we talked about how we are called to live in the way that he did, to live a life that we also welcome those interruptions into our lives. And so we've been looking at these different moments in Jesus' story. Last week we looked at a number of interruptions, and again, we're going to look at another interruption in Jesus' story. But also we've been talking about some stories that a lot of us have probably known. But just looking at it through that lens of how it started with an interruption. And again, we kind of come to a story like this. It's the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. A lot of us know that story. It's a pretty popular story. But there's a lot of little interesting details in this story that just really bring it to life. So if you have a Bible this morning, you can open up to Matthew chapter 14. And we're going to be hanging out in Matthew chapter 14. Also, like we've been doing, we'll dive into Mark chapter 6 a little bit, because he tells the story too, so we'll pick up some of the details that Mark shares about the story along the way. But Matthew 14 is where we're going to hang out for most of our time this morning. So the story starts with this. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. So when he had heard what had happened, so the story starts with Jesus hearing something. What did he just hear? He heard about the brutal murder of John the Baptist, that John the Baptist had been beheaded. He had been brutally murdered. And if you've been around for a little bit, in our last series, we talked about John the Baptist, and we talked about the significance of his life. And John the Baptist was an incredibly important character and played an incredibly important role in the story. But also, he was a relative of Jesus. If you remember that John's mother, Elizabeth, was a relative, or if some translations you read may say cousin, of Mary, the mother of Jesus. And so we're told a little bit, we get a little glimpse of Mary and Elizabeth's relationship in that story. But as we follow in through the story, we don't get too many stories about Jesus' childhood. So we don't, hear about, John and Jesus playing t-ball together as kids or anything like that. But you see that they're relatives, and you see this relationship a little bit between their mothers. And so also then later on we see that Jesus was baptized by John. And now he's been beheaded. He's been brutally murdered. And Jesus, being a human and having feelings, was affected by this. And he's now mourning that a relative of his, a loved one of his, has been brutally murdered. And so what does he want to do? He wants to get away from the crowd for a moment. They've been traveling from place to place, and we see constantly there was a crowd, and the crowd followed him. And last week we talked about the story of how the crowd was so loud that it was almost crushing him. So Jesus was constantly surrounded by people, and now he hears about this. He hears that John the Baptist has been brutally murdered, and he wants a moment. He wants to withdraw, get on a boat, go to a solitary place, go park out on a nice island, and just take a breather for a moment. He wants to get away from the crowd and just take a moment. So I love this story because you see the humanity of Jesus. You see how relatable he is. I don't know about you, but I'm a pretty extroverted person. I love people. I love to be around people. I love talking to people. I love meeting new people. And I love to kind of go. And I got a lot of energy, and I love meeting people and talking to people. But every once in a while, I kind of get to a moment where it's just like, I just need to sit and quiet for a moment and just have a moment alone. And so we see a little bit of Jesus' humanity here. We're going to see a lot of things that I feel like you can probably relate to in Jesus' life. Some of those details that Mark fills in for us in Mark chapter 6, verse 31, it says this: "Then, because so many people were coming and going, they did not even have a chance to eat. And he said, 'Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest.'" So, grieving's one thing, but not having a chance to eat. Oh, come on. You don't want to get hangry, too. So, and so, they've been going, and they've been facing the crowds, and they've been traveling, and they're doing a lot. And now Jesus receives this difficult news. And so he says to his disciples, let's get away for a bit. Let's take a moment, let's hop on a boat, let's go find a nice quiet place, and let's just get some rest. I imagine the disciples are probably like, yes, sounds great. We could use a little rest. We've been going. We left our lives behind to follow you, and we've been doing it. We've been going place to place. We've been traveling, crowds every single day, everywhere we go, and everything we do. Getting on a boat, going to find a nice quiet place, and just unplugging to rest and relax. That sounds pretty great. So, getting on a little vacation here. So, hopping back into Matthew, continuing along through the story, jumping right back to the verse that we started with, verse 13. We said, when Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. But before we can even finish the verse, what happens? Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. So we can't even make it through this verse before he's interrupted. He's got this plan. Let's go. Let's unplug for a moment. Let's recharge our own batteries. Find a nice little private island. We'll sit out in our beach chairs and just unplug. Just be alone. Have a nice little trip. It's going to be great. And then guess what? Some people heard about it, and then they follow him by foot. So, the disciples hop on their boat. It's like, oh, man, this is going to be great. We're going on a little trip. This is nice. Jesus is taking us along with him. That's pretty nice. Jesus is like, hey, I got to go deal with the crowd. I got to go charge my batteries. No, you guys come along with me. Yeah. Private vacation with Jesus. This is nice. We're getting in our boat. We're going, And then they're looking. It's like, uh-oh. And right along the shore, right just on foot, these people are just following him. They're tracking with him. They're figuring out, oh, where's he going to go? We're going to get ahead of him. So they're following him on foot. They come after him following on foot. They think, oh, man, we're sailing our worries away. And then they look to the shore, and their worries are just following right after him, tracking him down. Mark continues, verse 32 and 33 says this. So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. But many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. Beat them there. They're going by boat. They're going to try and find their nice solitary place to unplug and relax. And they're tracking. They're figuring out where they're going, and they beat them there. They get there ahead of them. They're just trying to find some peace and quiet, and they can't escape it. They cannot escape it. It's like Elvis, okay? Or like the Beatles, or the Rolling Stones, or Michael Jackson, or the Backstreet Boys, or Justin Bieber. Does that cover all the bases? Okay, so no matter how old you are today, you get you get it. We're covering all the generations. He is just attracting this crowd. He can't escape the crowd. No matter where he goes, they're following him. Jesus! And they get ahead and they figure out where he's going. And so then they're pulling up to their nice private island, and boom, there's the crowd waiting for them. And so Jesus is trying to find some peace and quiet. He can't get it. Can't get no satisfaction. Sorry, Rolling Stones. Sorry, we're talking about the Rolling Stones. So Jesus is trying to beat it. Sorry. So sorry. So Jesus is just trying to say goodbye, but the crowd keeps saying hello, hello. I don't know why you say goodbye. Sorry. So Jesus is just trying to unplug and trying to find the meaning of being lonely. But he can't, because he is larger than life. Sorry, okay. If you got all those jokes, congratulations. We got a gold sticker for you on the way out. You've stayed relevant over the years. Congratulations. So Jesus can't escape the crowd. Everywhere he goes, they're buzzing. They're following him. They recognize him. They're getting ahead of him. They realize and they see where they're going. Hopping back into Matthew, verse 14. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. So here we go. He's facing this hard time, just finding out about the death of a loved one. We're going to go unplug. We're going to recharge. And then they get on their boat, and they're sailing to their nice destination. And they get there to their own private island. But instead of being greeted by a butler that's going to take their bags, boom, there's the crowd right there waiting for them again. So the vacation is not going as planned. Our rest and relaxation, it looks like a thing that we can't get anywhere. No matter where we go, we can't escape the crowd. And so once again, we see an interruption. Jesus, in a time where it seems like, man, he needs it. He just needs to get away to unplug. He needs this time to just be alone, to be with God, to recharge. And here we are, interrupted again by a large crowd. So the question is, like we've been asking each week, how did he respond to this interruption? I think maybe this might be the biggest one yet, the biggest interruption, because he's in the middle of facing something really difficult, and he's trying to get away from the crowd. And now he faces the crowd once again. But even in the midst of that, what happens says that he had compassion on them. He had compassion on them. That's what we talked about last week. Jesus, how did he find the power to respond to these constant interruptions? It was because he had compassion on them. And so once again, we see Jesus moved by this compassion. He had compassion on them, and he healed their sick. Mark tells us this in verse 34. When Jesus landed and saw the large crowd, he had compassion on them. Why? Because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Does that sound familiar? No? I'll preach the last sermon again. Don't make me do it. Because they were like sheep without a shepherd. He had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. And so Jesus steps out onto private island in vacation mode. And what's he do? He's surrounded by a crowd, and he teaches them, and he heals their sick. And this is a moment where you would think, like if anywhere, this would have been the moment where Jesus could have been like, can you guys just give me a break here? Like, come on. Like, you saw me trying to sail away from you guys, and you're running around the crowd, tracking me down. Like, couldn't you just give me a moment? Like, clearly, I just need to be alone for a minute. Look at all I've done. I've traveled from place to place, surrounded by crowds, and I'm healing the sick and performing all these miracles and teaching everyone. Can I just get a moment to myself? But again, he doesn't. He's moved by that compassion. He heals their sick. He begins teaching them. This time that it was supposed to be devoted to just being alone with God and kind of having that moment to recharge and unplug. Again, now he's teaching and he's healing. So, he's moved by compassion because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Verse 15 says this. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." So the disciples see an opportunity here. Like, hey, maybe we can still save this vacation. Maybe we can still find that peace. Maybe we can get a little moment to relax. It's getting late here. We are out in this remote place. We're in the middle of nowhere. There's not a Taco Bell in sight. This is our opportunity. Jesus, send the crowd away. Send them away. Let's get rid of them here. This is our chance. Did I do it here? Yeah. What did he say? He said, so that they can go and buy themselves some food. Send them away. Let's get our time here. They're trying to salvage this trip, trying to still get that moment for themselves. And so, disciples, send them away. This is our opportunity. And what does Jesus say? How does he reply? You go get them something to eat. And Jesus replied, they don't need to go away. You give them something to eat. You get them something to eat. And you got to imagine the disciples are like, oh, you got to be kidding me, right? We got in the boat. We were in vacation mode. I had my fanny pack on and everything. I was ready. And now I'm here, and you're teaching them, and you're healing the sick, and we're surrounded by people. There's thousands of people here, and now you want me to just whip up dinner for all of them? Do you realize how much this is going to cost us? How are we going to feed this many people? Even a Chick-fil-A drive-thru cannot handle 5,000 people. Jesus, what are we supposed to do here? What are we supposed to do? We're out in the middle of nowhere. There's thousands of people, and you say, we don't need to send them away. This is our opportunity. We're supposed to be on vacation here. We're supposed to be unplugging. And now we're supposed to make them dinner? They were sick, you healed them. You're God, and you taught them. And now we also need to feed them. But he puts it on the disciples. You feed them. What? And so they reply, verse 17, and say, we here only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And that's not enough. We have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, and we're standing in front of a crowd of thousands of people, and you say we don't need to send them away. What are we supposed to do? And so Jesus replies to them. He says, bring them here to me, he said. And he directed the people to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. I love that he brought them in. He didn't just say, look what I can do. Watch me feed them. He said, no, you're going to feed them. Go grab that fish, grab the loaves of bread we have. Start passing them out. So he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. And they all ate and were satisfied. Finally got that satisfaction. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. And the number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. So that's usually where our story ends. When we talk about that's the miracle. What happened? There's a big group of people. Jesus fed them. it's a miracle. But I do want to point out what happens immediately after this. Jumping back into Mark chapter 6. In your Bible, there might be a little space there, and it's like, hey, this is a new story. But right there, we see the word immediately. So right after, immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into a boat, which I imagine they got to be like, oh, you got to be kidding me. You with the boats. Every time it's something. We get in the boats and then something happens, right? So Jesus made the disciples get into a boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida, and he dismissed the crowd. After leaving them, what did he do? He went on a mountainside to pray. So Jesus did take that moment. He eventually gets that rest. He eventually gets to unplug and get alone and get away from the crowd. So it wasn't that Jesus just neglected it. It wasn't that Jesus was like, I'm grieving and I just need to toughen through it because other people have needs. It was delayed. He was willing to be interrupted even in the midst of his grieving, but he still took that time. When he saw the people, he had compassion for them. So he doesn't just send them away. He meets their needs. He saw that they were like sheep without a shepherd, and so he teaches them. He had compassion on them. He healed those who were sick, and then he meets their physical needs, their physical hunger, and then he takes that time to unplug. It's such an incredible story. I love this story so much because you see that Jesus doesn't just talk the talk, but he really walks the walk. He didn't just step into the world and say, let me give you a list of rules, and this is what you need to do to be my followers. He set the example for us. He taught us, but he also lived it out. He talked the talk, but he also walked the walk. And the biggest thing, the craziest thing about this is just how backwards it is. Really, the whole story of the gospel is just incredible. That God is the one who deserves all the glory. He is the one who is worthy to be served. He is the one who deserves to be served. He's the one who deserves it all. I mean, he is the creator of it all. He holds all things together. Everything was created by him. Everything was created for him. And he created a perfect world. And then who messed it up? Us. We did. Our sin. We chose sin. Man chose sin. And so what does he do? He steps into this world that had turned our backs on him, a world that existed for his glory, that should have been serving him. He steps into this world as we had our backs turned to him, and then he lived in a radically selfless way, constantly giving, constantly serving. And then he laid down his life for us. It is truly bizarre. It is really crazy. And when we think of it through that perspective of, man, who I am and who God is, and then Jesus stepping into the world and the life that he lived, it is just bizarre. It is crazy. And I think that when we start with this understanding, every action of Jesus is just like, whoa, whoa. Like, God steps into the world, shouldn't he just be like, sitting there and we're like fanning them and giving them grapes? Like, I can't believe you came. I mean, we really messed this place up. Have you seen it? It's bad. I can't believe you actually came for us. But still, they choose sin and they turn back to the sin. And he says, man, they are sheep without a shepherd. And he had compassion for them and he loved them. And so when we start with that acknowledgement that, oh man, God does not owe me anything. And it brings us to that place of humility. And then we see the generous life that Jesus lived. It's a life of radical generosity. Even in moments where it's like, we should protect his time here. The disciples are like, send these people away. Like, I mean, you've taught them, you've healed them, it's dinner time. They're stepping in, trying like, hey, we got to protect our guy here. He needs some time to unplug. He said we were going on the boat so that we come here alone. Now there's a big crowd. You can almost see this sort of like defensiveness in the disciples. Part of them probably wants to get away from the crowd because they want a moment to themselves too. But also, it's like, Jesus, you've been just pouring out. Get alone. Recharge your batteries a little bit here, Jesus. Even in that moment, he is so generous. He's sitting there grieving the loss of one of his own loved ones, and he's still meeting the needs of other people. And like I said last week, it's easy sometimes to just look at the life of Jesus and be like, oh, well, that's Jesus. I mean, of course, that's Jesus. But he was also human. He was God, but he was also a human. And he felt the things that we felt. He experienced the things that we experienced. So when we look at that, the humanity of him and what he's feeling, what he's experiencing, what he's going through, and still he lives this life of radical generosity. And he gets interrupted, but he doesn't just end it. He still does take that time. He withdrew. He stepped away from the chaos. He found a peaceful place away from the distractions. And what did he do? He prayed. He prayed. I love that. Because again, we don't see Jesus doing these things that it's like, oh, I could never do that. He's using magic Jesus powers here that I don't have access to. He's so normal. He got alone, and he went on the mountainside, away from the distractions, and he prayed. You can pray, okay? I can pray. We can get alone with God and pray. And if Jesus did it, we probably should too. Right? If anyone could have just been like, I'm fine. I'm just going to keep going, keep chugging here. We got a mission. It would have been Jesus. But Jesus lived a life to set an example for us to follow. And so when he was going through that difficult time, yes, he was willing to be interrupted, but he also took that time to get alone, to pray, to just connect with God. And so maybe we should do the same too. Maybe we should follow that example. Another thing I want to point out is what we looked at in Mark chapter 6, verse 31. When he went to get alone, what did he say to his disciples? Come with me. Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest. I can almost hear Jesus saying that to me so many times. Come with me by yourself to a quiet place and get some rest. Anyone else? Maybe you can just hear Jesus saying that to you. Hey, I know life is crazy. Hey, I know you're busy. Come with me by yourself to a quiet place and get some rest. Those good words right there. I love that. And so Jesus, when you look at his life, it's like he's living pedal to the metal. Everywhere he goes, boom, miracles are happening and healings are happening, and he's teaching and just pouring out constantly. And even the Bible says that, man, if we would have wrote down everything that he actually did, there wouldn't be enough books on earth to fill these things. He was doing so much, pedal to the metal, going place to place and teaching and healing and performing miracles. But he also took time to get alone and to pray and to talk to God. And this isn't the only time he does this. He does this time and time again. And what I love here is that while he prayed alone, he brought the disciples along with him. Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest. He invited them in with him. These guys knew what he was going through. They knew what he was experiencing. He was living his life together with them, and then he invited them, come with me. Come with me. You remember the story of the Garden of Gethsemane? Another time where Jesus prayed. What did he do? Who went with him? The disciples went with him. Another time where Jesus is agonizing over the brutal death that he is about to face. What did he do in that hard time, in his distress, and when he felt the human things that we felt? He got alone in a quiet place, and he talked with God, and he prayed. But also, again, he doesn't do it alone. He brought his disciples along with him. He went alone and prayed, but he brought them along with him. And then Peter and James and John, he brought them even a little further. And what did he say to them? You pray also. You pray also. And so Jesus is the one guy who could do it alone, but he didn't. He didn't. He refused to, because he set an example for us. Because maybe he could have done it alone, but you cannot do it alone. And I cannot do it alone. And so Jesus modeled that for us. He didn't just say, you need community, you need to go to church. He lived it out. He modeled it. First thing he did, remember a couple weeks ago, first thing he did as he's about to kick off his ministry, he gathers his disciples. Come follow me. We're doing this together. And now we look, and what does he do? It's not just them being spectators. Go pass out the bread. You go feed them. He's inviting them to be a part of what he's doing. And so Jesus lived in that community. And even when he was going through the difficult things in life, he didn't do it alone. He brought them in on it and said, I'm going to go pray, and you go pray. We're going to go pray together. And so Jesus modeled that for us. He had this literal small group of 12 guys that he shared his life with day in and day out. And when the crowds were swarming him, he brought them along with him when he needed that moment to escape. So the question is, who's your small group? Who is your small group? Who are those guys? Who are the people in your life that know exactly what you are walking through? They know exactly the difficulties that you are facing in this season of life, the things right now that are heavy on your heart. Who are those people? At this church, we have life groups. And we hammer that. You hear me talk about life groups all the time because it is critically important, because we're trying to follow the example set by Jesus. And we can't do that in isolation. We have to do it together. We have to be in small groups, sharing our lives together. When Jesus was going through this, he didn't go out to that massive crowd and say, listen, I'm going through something difficult. Someone I love just died. What did he do? He took those 12 guys. And they knew what he was going through. And then they withdrew to a quiet place to get some rest. And they prayed together. And Jesus modeled this. Are you following the example of Jesus? Are you following the example of Jesus? You need to live together in community. You need these people. A small group where you can come together and share what is going on in your life. People who are praying for you intentionally, not just, hey, I'm praying for you, brother, but it's, I know what you're going through this week, and I know on Wednesday you're going into the doctor, and you're going to get the results, and so Wednesday we're going to be praying for you, and we know what's going on in each other's lives. That's hard to do in this big group of people, right? We're not a massive church, but still, we got to gather together in those smaller groups. We got to get committed to living life together. So if you're not a part of a small group, I want to invite you to join a small group. We have a group. I have a group here on Sunday nights. Come be a part of that. Don't miss out on that. If you are a follower of Jesus, you play a vital role in the church. And the church plays a vital role in your life. Okay, we need to do this. We have to follow the example of Jesus. And I think one of the places where the church has lost it along the way is that we cling to the words of Jesus while neglecting the example that he set for us, while neglecting the model that he put in place for us to follow. We have to live, and it's not like it's a mystery, like, wow, I didn't even think about it. The Bible said, live the life he did. How did he live? He lived together with these 12 guys, and he shared his life with them, and they prayed together, and they traveled together, and they went through and grieved along with him. They knew what he was going through, and they prayed together. We have to follow that same example. And the other example that Jesus sets for us here is generosity. He lives a life of radical generosity. He's interrupted this time, not just, hey, I was talking to somebody, or I was going somewhere, in the middle of grief, in the middle of a struggle, in the middle of some pain. And he was moved by compassion, and he taught them, and he healed the sick, and he gives them all dinner. That is radically generous, even in the time where it's like, hey, Jesus, shouldn't we just be focusing on you right now? Let's make you a good meal, you know? Radical generosity. Jesus saw others as a priority, even when he had needs of his own. He saw them. He was moved by compassion because they had needs. They had needs. And he could meet those needs, and he could heal them. They were like sheep without a shepherd, and he could teach them and point them to the shepherd. And they were physically hungry, and he was able to give them food. And so Jesus saw others' needs as a priority, even when he had needs of his own. Proverbs 3, verse 27 and 28 says this: do not withhold good from those who deserve it when it's in your power to help them. And that's Jesus. Jesus, I have the power to help them. How am I supposed to withhold it? If you can help your neighbor now, don't say, come back tomorrow, and then I'll help you. I can be guilty of that. It's like, yeah, I know they have needs, but let's just do that tomorrow. let's just do that tomorrow. Let's put that off. But this is the way we're called to live, not to withhold from doing good. That if we can help, that we should help, and we shouldn't delay giving help. And when we do this, we live as a reflection of Jesus. We are called to be generous because he was generous. And when we live a life of generosity, we point people to the shepherd. When we go out and we live a life of generosity in a group of sheep without shepherd, we live as a reflection of him, and we help point to him. Last week we talked about living a life of compassion, about how we're called to compassion. And then we talked about how judgment is a roadblock. Right? How judgment becomes that roadblock. Well, this morning, I want to, in similar fashion, I want to tell you the same thing, that we were called to live in a radically generous way. And the roadblock will be our selfishness. We have to be careful that we don't become like the birds from Finding Nemo, that we don't become like those seagulls, right? Mine, 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 mine. And it's easy to look at our lives and it's mine, right? My stuff, my time, my money, mine, 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 mine. We have to remember where we started. How did we come to Jesus? As children. But we all have to come to him as children. We come to him empty-handed, saying, I have nothing to offer you. I have nothing to show for. I have nothing to give to you that might earn me the life that you offer me. To earn that salvation, I come to you empty-handed. And we are saved by grace alone, by his goodness, by his grace. That's it. And so we come empty-handed. And God is our provider. We mentioned this earlier, but the only reason we exist is because God knitted us together in our mother's wombs. Okay? The only reason you ever came to life is because God knitted you together in your mother's womb. And the only reason you are alive sitting in these chairs and breathing today, or maybe you're at home and you're watching online, the only reason you are alive and able to hear this and be here today is because God has sustained you. And everything is his. He is the creator and the rightful owner of it all. So we can't say, mine, 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 mine. We have to look at God and say, how generous you have been to me. Because you are the provider of all of it. All of it. And it's easy to say, man, well, I worked hard. You know, God didn't just hand me a college degree. And God didn't just, do that hard work. God's the provider of it all. As the Israelites prepared to enter the promised land, God told them, listen, once you get in there, you're going to be doing good, and you're going to be eating good, and it's going to be real easy to look at how you're flourishing and how your crops are growing and how oh man, look at all the sheep we got. Look at all the goats we got. I'm doing so good. And he's going to say, it's going to be real easy. You're going to be tempted to look and say, look at what the work of my hands has done. But none of that would be possible if I would not have given this land to you. God is the provider of every breath we breathe, every day that we have. And yeah, we work hard, and there's results to our actions, but God is the provider. And we have nothing without him. Nothing. We have to start with that acknowledgement. We have to start with that humility where we started this morning, is that how backwards the story is that I live a life of sin. I live a life of guilt. He comes and lives a life of perfection and then dies in my place. That's the humility that it has to start with. And when we understand that, we can live generous. Because then I look at my time, and it's the time that God has provided me. And I can look at my money, and it's the money that God has provided me. I can look at my stuff and my possessions and acknowledge that I have nothing without him. And listen, we're all busy. We could all sit around and say, well, I got so much going on, and my job, and, my kids, and sports, and activity. That's called being adult, okay? We all love to talk about how busy our schedule is because it makes us seem important. We're all busy. We're all busy. And we're all given the same amount of time. There's 24 hours in the day, okay? And God grants it to us each day. And how generous are we being with it? It can be easy to say, oh, well, right now life's just tough and we got this and we got that. God gave you 24 hours. What are you going to do with it? And tomorrow He gives you 24 hours. What are you going to do with it? How generous are you going to be with it? Are you going to say, well, I'm just so full. My schedule's so full. God gave you those hours. He gave you those minutes. He is the provider of it all. And so I don't look at it as my time anymore, but God, thank you for this. And what am I going to do with it? How generous can I be with it? Look at my money. My money, I worked hard. I earned this. But God, you provided. I wouldn't have any of it if it weren't for you. How generous am I going to be with it? With our time, with our money, our stuff, whatever it is, we have to acknowledge that God is the provider of it all. And we got to look at our lives, and maybe we need to make some cuts, right? We all have busy schedules, but we don't do everything. Sometimes I think of all the things I want to do and I want to accomplish and the things I want to get done, and I look at how many hours are in a day, and there's not enough time to do it. Maybe you can relate to that. I'm sure you can. And so what do? We prioritize our time. And some things don't get our time. And some things we have to say no to. And so maybe we need to look at our life and we need to schedule some generosity. If we're living life and we're just like a bulldozer plowing through, sorry, I can't do that. Sorry, I can't help you. We got to look and say, hey, God gave me the hours. How many hours am I giving back? God gave me this day. How generous am I being with it? God gave me my money. How generous am I being with it? God gave me these things. How generous am I being with it? Galatians 6 verse 9, I want to close here, says this: let us not become weary in doing good. For at a proper time, we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Listen, I know that what we've been talking about over the last couple weeks has not been super easy to implement. This has not been a sermon series called, 10 easy steps to refill your cup and feel refreshed, right? We're talking about living a life of purpose. We're talking about inviting interruptions into our lives, inviting inconvenience and even difficulty, and taking on the needs of others. It's tough and it's hard. But I guarantee that if we can live a life of generosity, God could move in some incredible ways. Hebrews 13, verse 15 and 16 says this: through Jesus, therefore, let us continually offer to God a sacrifice of praise, the fruit of lips that openly profess His name, and do not forget to do good and to share it with others. For with such sacrifices, God is pleased. That sounds so easy. Don't forget to do good and share. Like, that's like the kind of things that like you taught. It's like so simple. Don't forget to do good and share. Like how simple and easy that sounds. But that's the kind of sacrifice that's pleasing to God. That's it. I do that and you're happy. Just do good and share. Let's do good to people. Let's love people. And let's be willing to make sacrifices to do that, because that's the kind of sacrifice that God is pleased with. If we are willing to be interrupted, when we can overcome the judgment that we might feel and be moved by compassion, if we can overcome our own selfishness and our greed, and we can live generously, I can only imagine what God could do through us as a church. And so I pray that we would live in that way, that we would begin to see our interruptions as opportunities, and that we would remember to look to Jesus, to live the life He did, to follow the model that He set for us, and that we wouldn't do it alone, that we would do this together, that we would gather together in smaller groups in that community, and we would share our lives, and that we would pray for each other, and that we'd also take that time to be alone with God, knowing that Jesus did it. And so, man, how much more must I need it just to pray and just to get some rest so that we can live this life of generosity. So I pray that we would be moved by compassion, that we would overcome judgment, that we would overcome that selfishness, and that we would live a life of radical generosity and see what God might do through us. Let me pray for us. God, we love You. It's easy to love You because You are so generous to us. We are deserving of nothing. You created a beautiful, perfect world, and we messed it up with sin. And you were generous to us. You showed us grace. God, I thank you for the life that Jesus lived on this earth, and I pray that we would look to him as an example of the life that we should live as his followers. And God, I pray that through the life we live, that people would look on, the people who are sheep and they are wandering and they are lost and they are in need of a Savior. God, I pray that the way that we would live would point them to the shepherd. God, that we would overcome our judgmental feelings, that we would overcome our own selfishness and understand that you are the provider of it all, and God, that in response to that, we would live generously. And that through that, we would point people to a generous God. Jesus, we love you. We thank you for the life that you give us. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.